Welcome to another episode of the Star Local Media High School Sports Podcast. My name is Matt Welch, being joined by Devin, Hasson, and David Wolman. It is a Tuesday, recording this one day later than usual. Hope everybody enjoyed their long weekend. And yes, we are back with another episode. And what a week, gentlemen, because practices are underway for our 5A and 6A high schools. High school football practices have begun. Everybody right now is working out, so just clearing one more pivotal hurdle in the lead up to September 24th and the actual start of the seasons for our 5A and 6A high schools. So as has been the case over these last couple weeks, we are previewing things in anticipation of the start of the season, since the 5A and 6A schools comprise about 95% of our coverage and whatnot. So yes, we've come up with 20 questions that will kind of define our coverage for the upcoming season and whatnot. We have knocked out 8 of those questions. We got 4 more. So let's dive right into it. Obviously, this is with the big schools beginning practices this week, it's been a pretty interesting past few weeks with the small schools, classes 1A through 4A, with them going through all of this routine from them starting practices back in August to the actual beginning of their respective seasons on August 27th, 28th, and whatnot. So you've had a lot of coaches around the area that have kind of just been kind of waiting anxiously just to see how this all goes. As far as these small schools kind of being a bit of a guinea pig, a bit of a test balloon as to how the state's going to initially handle playing football during a global pandemic. So let's start obviously with a couple questions related to the pandemic for today's episode. What can the state's big schools take away from how these smaller schools have conducted their business early into the 2020 season? As far as what this means for us, we've only got 2 schools that have been playing football so far, with Salina and Sunnyvale. Devin, as far as kind of how Sunnyvale's conducted business, kind of what have you noticed on their end as far as kind of how they're going about navigating all this, and to the point where they've at least been able to play their first 2 games of the season, no questions asked?
Yeah, I don't know how much the big schools are going to take from the small, because I think everybody, this is, an unprecedented situation. So there's no blueprint for what you're supposed to do, for how you're supposed to handle it. And there's a big difference just in terms of day-to-day workouts, because, Sunnyvale, you may have 50 to 60 kids in that program out, whereas some of our 6A schools have 200, 250 kids. Yeah. So it's a little bit easier. I know they've set up stations where they rotate through to keep distancing. Some people will be working on skills and practice while others do conditioning, and then they swap. Mm-hmm. Well, when you're working with, 150, 200, 250 kids, it's a little more difficult to do that. But I think they've kind of kept an eye on what they've done. A lot of conversations being had in terms of, everything down to the most, smallest little detail in terms of, what time do they report? How do we organize temperature checks? How long are we going to work out? How are we going to handle this? How are we going to handle that? On up to game day preparation. How are we going to do the buses? How are we going to do transportation? What's our protocol, before the games? So they're keeping an eye, but it's just really just kind of a trial and error thing. Yeah. I think that, you look at, you mentioned Sunnyvale and obviously Salina, they didn't exactly know the best way to go about doing things. I'm sure they made a lot of changes, just small changes from week 1 to week 2. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll continue to see the same thing with the bigger schools. They're just going to they're going to come in with a plan, but there's going to be a lot of tweaks, a lot of changes to I guess do the best job they can to keep everybody safe and to abide by the rules that have been laid down.
It really, I think it does help, though, that you got that time over the summer as a bit of a head start to get acclimated to all this. Obviously they've been, as far as things like wearing masks and, social distancing, all these parameters have been in place since June for a lot of these schools when they began strength and conditioning workouts. So it's nothing should be foreign to these kids or the coaches and whatnot as far as how to conduct things during practices, and even, I think back to August and covering Salina and their second day of practice, and just the, how everybody's got to have that mask on unless you're actively participating in a drill. Just the job that the coach is doing, making sure that the kids are, staying apart. Everybody's got to bring their own water bottles. Just these little changes that you're already comfortable with. It's no longer is it this new normal anymore. It's just kind of the way things are for these kids. So it does help over the summer that they at least got an idea as to what this is all going to be like. And it's just about carrying it out and just being consistent, being accountable with it. The thing is, I've obviously we've all kind of seen how our schools are kind of handling this as far as attending these workouts and looking at the steps that they're all taking. And that's, the part of that I feel probably most comfortable with is just the job that the coaches have done as far as leaving no stone unturned, as far as doing everything they can to make sure that their kids follow some sort of structured, organized approach on how to handle this. The question is obviously then what happens though after practice and throughout the other 20 hours, throughout the day and whatnot, when you're not under the coach's supervision as far as how these kids are going to handle it. Because, the coaches can only, have an eye on these kids for so long.
Well, it's especially now that a lot of in-school instruction has begun. Garland ISD started today. Mesquite ISD goes back next week. All these school districts are starting to open campus back up. And so that's just another thing you got to think about because, like you say, they can keep an eye on them when they're just showing up at school for the workouts and for the practices. Now you're factoring in 5 hours of changing classes. And I know they've taken a lot of steps to improve the safety in just in the hallways and in the classrooms, but that's still something else that's going to be in the back of their minds and something that hopefully won't be a factor that kind of sends us into another tailspin.
David, had you seen anything at your, whether it was a trip through Capel, Lake Dallas, or the Colony, anything that had jumped out to you as far as how those schools are kind of handling things?
I went to the Colony yesterday for the first day of practice, and
yeah, you were busy yesterday.
Yeah, I was. I was pretty much on my first day tour out there. One thing I noticed when I went to the Colony is as soon as they just finished up their practice on the field, they had team meetings right after that. So normally they might have like a big room set up for like a big team meeting, but they set aside like several coaches' offices. They set up some rooms that might not more normally be used for meetings, and they spread out those kids into those rooms. And they had like chairs, set like 6 feet apart from each other, so they make sure they get that social distancing in there. And in that hallway right there, when kids are picking up some food and some water to drink in the hallway, there's coaches like spread out, just like, hey, make sure you wear your mask, make sure you wear your mask, stuff like that. So they're making sure that no stone unturned as far as social distancing is going unturned.
So yeah, obviously it's going to be a very, very just kind of a case by case scenario each week. Every school is going to have their own different approach as to what they feel is best for their kids, and that's the thing. Like, it's as different as the approaches may be. Obviously everybody has the same interest in mind and just wanting to do whatever they can to keep their kids safe and try to somehow navigate this season, without having things get set back. Because at this rate, even say what you will about the small schools and the virus being less concentrated in those areas, but you've already had cases around the state where some games have had to be canceled and whatnot. So it's going to happen at some point. As far as you having to deal with some kid on your team getting the virus and whatnot. You just have to be responsible on how you go about handling that, and just the sort of accountability as far as making sure that that it doesn't really something that gets widespread or impacts the team or anything, or just does anything that could put your season in jeopardy. It's just going to be something that every week we're just going to be just kind of on pins and needles as far as like, okay, are you guys playing this week? And, how'd you guys, has everyone, any issues come up, anybody test positive or anybody feeling sick? And it's just going to be a bit of a white knuckle ride, so to speak.
If you're a coach this year, you make sure you get that old Rolodex, rolling. If you have to cancel a game, or other team has to cancel a game, just, try to find whoever you can to on the spot right there to see what you can do to get that another game, within like 3 or 4 days at that spot.
So let's see. Then looking ahead now to our next question. These last couple of weeks we've dived into the you're basically just talking about some potential statistical leaders in our coverage area this season. We started off talking quarterbacks. Last week we talked running backs, and we're going to stay on offense, and obviously round that out with talking about some players that could potentially lead Star Local Media's coverage area in receiving this season. Always a talented crop of receivers to roll through the Metroplex every year. So which ones in our coverage area particularly stand out as far as some who might vie for the receiving title in our coverage area? David, anybody that came to mind for your coverage area?
Yeah, I wrote down a few players here. First player that came to my mind is from Marcus J. Michael Sturdivant. Last year he had 87 receptions, 1,125 receiving yards, 10 TDs. He's a Cal commit. And, what better quarterback to throw to the ball than somebody who's going to LSU, Garrett Nussmeier. So, with him on one side and Dallas Dudley, they're both, it's not like he's going to have to be double covered every single time. So, he's going to get his fair share of, yards and TDs. So, that was my top pick right there.
Devin, where'd you land on this?
I have a few. I think, especially with what's gone on through the lack of off-season workouts and stuff, having a established quarterback is just such a huge advantage.
For sure.
I have so many of my teams that are breaking in a new starter that's basically had no time to work out with the team or on the varsity or what have you. So, you look at kind of the returning quarterbacks that are back in the fold, Garrett Rangel over at Lone Star. You got to replace a new number one, and a number one that just happened to rewrite the Texas high school football record book last year. But Trace Buckler out there, Marvin Mims is going to overshadow anybody he's playing with. But, 54 catches, 824 yards, 5 scores last year. They need a new number one. He's shown, the potential to take over that spot. And if he becomes the same kind of favorite target that Marvin Mims did, he's going to put up some huge numbers. You go over to Independence where they have Braylon Braxton coming back. And so you kind of sit there and look at a guy like Ezekiel McMillan, who had 36 catches last year. But again, he was not the number one option. Frisco ISD has a lot of those that kind of fall in that same boat with had 40 to 50 catches last year, but you never know how those numbers can improve this year. Thomas Donnelly over at Lebanon Trail, Evan Stewart over at Liberty, Chase Lowry over at Frisco, who is the district MVP, but he plays both ways.
Yeah.
So he's obviously a very highly regarded defensive back, but he also averages 23 yards of reception. So if they decide to get him the ball on offense, he may not lead the area in receiving or in receptions, but receiving yards could be a possibility. But, it's really hard to say for some of these other teams that are breaking in new quarterbacks. Zion Washington over at Reedy led the team in receiving last year. Saxe's been able to produce some really good wide receivers of late, but they have a new quarterback with Alex Orgy coming in. Noah McDilley over at Sunnyvale, as we dip into the lower classifications, had a really good year last year, but they've been rotating 3 guys in, trying to get that quarterback position settled, so his number's going to reflect that. So, like I say, if I had to get early on projections, you got to go with a guy who has an established quarterback. And I think those are your early favorites.
I want to add a name into there, too. You mentioned established quarterbacks right there. I'm going to go to Kid at Capel, Anthony Black.
That's a good one.
Yeah, dual sport athlete. I don't know how this kid is not at least a 4-star recruit right there in football. He's only 24/7 Sports only has him listed as a 3-star recruit. I mean, this guy has at least 12 offers in football right there. He's picked up a couple over the last week or so. He had 859 yards and 9 TDs and really only his first season at playing varsity football.
Yeah.
So, and now he's got the same quarterback from last year who was like a first-year starter last year because of injury. And, you have those two, with an off-season together and, just imagine what they can do this year.
I had Anthony Black down too as a potential one, especially because you look last year. He was able to put up 47 catches, 859 yards, 9 touchdowns, but he essentially had 2 different quarterbacks throwing him the ball. It's just you never knew which week who was going to be starting a quarterback for Capel. So hopefully, if you get Ryan Walker from start to finish, maybe you get a little bit more consistency. And again, this kid's only a junior. He's still got the entire back half of his high school career to go. So obviously, still plenty of room to grow. And it does feel like his profile is just growing more and more each week in both football and basketball.
I think another thing that's going to help him too is they had a move in KJ Liggins. He played. He played for them as a freshman, but he's got 5 Division I offers, so it's not like they're going to be double teaming Black every single play.
Sure.
So Black's going to get his yards this year.
You've talked about just kind of having an established presence behind center, and just the benefit of having a receiver elsewhere that could potentially lure the secondary away from keying in on you. That's why I'm anxious to see what kind of year we get over at McKinney North from J.J. Henry. If you remember last year, McKinney North, it was the most prolific offense that school district has ever had behind Dylan Markowitz, and just that they were averaging, it felt like 600 yards a week, 50 points. It was just an absolute machine. J.J. Henry is really the lone holdover as far as skill position talent goes. They're breaking in a brand new quarterback this season. Markowitz has moved on to Syracuse, so they've got Hayden Richardson and Gavin Constantine battling it out to see who's going to be the quarterback. They've got a new running back, albeit one that still had experience as a backup last year in Jaden Smith. And McKinney North's track record certainly lends itself to some credibility when it comes to just next man up. They just have an absolute assembly line of talent at the running back position. You've got Henry, who last year was, obviously everybody was just playing catch up to Marvin Mims at the 5A level. But as far as our specific coverage area goes, Henry was actually the second highest receiving leader. He had 71 catches for almost 1,400 yards and 16 touchdowns. Those numbers, most years, those numbers lead the Metroplex.
Yeah.
When the other receiver isn't off setting records and whatnot. But again, everything is new around him. You have no more Brandon Frazier. Obviously, they're actually going to move his younger brother Dylan Frazier over to play tight end this year. But the other receivers on the outside are all inexperienced. Like I said, you got a new tight end. You've got a new offensive coordinator. Kyle Harden, is now the head coach over at Crandall. They promoted Kendall Brewer to be their OC. So so much is going to be new. Henry is still, an absolute he's got I don't have the recruiting profile in front of me, but I saw just an absolute laundry list of just Power 5 conference offers rolling in for him over the offseason. He's got a lot of schools that are after him, and probably pound for pound, maybe the most talented receiver that we have in our coverage area. But if so much of it relies on those other pieces around him, kind of meshing and being able to just deter, the opposing defense from just keying in on him and just trying to, again, just seeing double team after double team. Because that's one thing that you couldn't double team them last season, because there was always somebody, within their, they had like 4, their top 4 receivers all had like 600 or 700 yards receiving or something silly like that. So it's a bit of a different, the deck's been reshuffled a bit, but yes, obviously J.J. Henry very much at the front of mind when it comes to potentially leading our coverage area in receiving yardage. All right, let's move on then to our third question. This one is going to look at some first-year head coaches. Obviously, all sorts of coaching turnover in the offseason, as is the case every year. So with which new coaches are positioned to make an immediate impact? And it's been obviously making that impact and getting your team up to speed has been a little bit trickier than usual, given the nature of the pandemic and not getting a chance to, have your go through spring workouts, having to do all your installations virtually and whatnot. So, I don't know, Devin, where did you? Was there anybody that kind of sprung to mind for you on this one?
Well, I didn't have a lot of coaching turnover in my area, to be honest with you. There's been years where I've had several new head coaches. The only one notable was over at West Mesquite with Frank Sandoval taking over, and it's going to be tough. To have an immediate turnaround. West Mesquite has kind of been in a little bit of a down cycle just from a talent perspective. Yeah. They went through a nice run where they had a lot of really good players that would go on to play college ball, but they have some experience on defense, which will help them early on. But trying to bring in a new offense and implement that, like you just mentioned, it's tough anytime with no off season, but especially for a first year head coach, and especially the fact that they're breaking in a lot of new starters on offense who haven't had a chance to work out together, and again, and part of it too is their district. If realignment would have done them a nice favor and put them in a little bit more of an easier group, then you might be able to say, hey, this is a team that could turn things around. By the time district plays go, and they could be a playoff contender. But when you're lining up with Longview and Highland Park and Tyler and the aforementioned McKinney North and Sherman, it's just really hard to see. Based on what they've been able to do the last couple of years, them getting right back in. But again, that's the thing with someone like Coach Sandoval is you got to give him time and get the players, get those younger kids into the program. So I think West Mesquite, give it a couple of years, but if they were to do it this year, it would certainly be a big surprise.
I know, David, you didn't have any coaching turnover at your 3 high schools, but was there anyone that jumped to mind for this?
Outside of my coverage area, there's I actually wrote down 3 coaches right here.
Okay.
But the one that stuck out to the most in my mind is over at Lovejoy, Chris Ross.
Yes, that's a good one.
He's been like every position, coach possible. He's been head coach, he's been offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. He worked at Boise State for 2 years as well too. And also it seems like wherever he goes, the team just turns around instantly. Whenever he took over at Red Oak, they hadn't been to the third round of the playoffs since 2012. But within like the first couple of years, he had them. Like last year, they won 11-2, and they lost in the playoffs to state champion Aledo. So
no shame in that.
No shame in that. Yeah. No. You did good if you made it that far right there in the playoffs.
Absolutely.
So I think he can turn them around in a hurry. And obviously Lovejoy, they've had some success under Todd Ford, who's now at Plano. And so I think, that's a group that's really, eager to, build on what they've done under Coach Ford right there. They have that playoff pedigree right there.
For sure.
And I think, Coach Ross is just going to continue what they've done over there. and plus it's their district is kind of a little bit wide open right there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think Frisco's obviously the favorite in that district
For
right
sure.
there, but the other teams, it's pretty wide open. So whatever team shows up, on a given Friday is going to win in this district right here. So I think Lovejoy is going to have much a chance to compete with anybody.
Yeah, I mean, you look when Ross took over Red Oak, they were 2-8 in 2017, and then he was only there for 2 seasons, but they had a record of 20-4. And obviously qualified for the playoffs both seasons.
9-2 their first year.
Yeah, Lovejoy's got 13 returning starters, half of whom made the all-district team. You got Ralph Rucker, Reed Westervelt, Luke Mayfield, just a loaded offense. Some talent in the secondary with Chief Collins, Adam Eschler. I mean, Lovejoy traditionally does fairly well in that front. So I mean, you give a coach like Chris Ross that kind of talent to just start from. And yeah, I mean, it's a district that certainly would suggest that they might be able to have a little bit more success than usual for these coaches that are having to make this transition during a time when there's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of having to kind of think outside the box versus how coaches traditionally make this move. I mean just you look at the situation over at Plano and just what a circus that whole situation was with Cody Moore initially getting hired as the team's head coach and then backing out the day after being approved by the school board, and then as you mentioned Todd Ford, he was hired then just a few weeks later. And the biggest concern I had for Plano was just like when you look at that offense that they run. With Plano, it's just always been such a ground and pound, such a rugged, dating back to the Tom Kimbrough days back in the 80s. And now you're bringing dodgeball into the mix with Todd Ford and then some of his coaches, a lot of Todd Dodge disciples. So it's going to be a far more wide out, fast-paced offense, versus what Plano's been accustomed to. So how much time would it take to get your kids acclimated to that? As far as the installation process goes, at least, I mean, it does sound like, and this is not just with Plano, but a lot of the coaches in the area that I've talked to, like, just they feel like the time they got in August, that the sport specific skill training, that portion that the UIL afforded them just a couple hours a day, that really did do something as far as making up for that time that they lost out on in the fall. Now, obviously, there's no way to approximate the contact aspect of it until this week. At the end of the week, when you go through that 5-day acclimation period, and you can finally put on your pads and whatnot. But as far as just getting a brand new system installed, both offensively and defensively, it sounds like, at least in Plano's case, that for Coach Ford, who's been, he opened up Cedar Ridge, then he made the move to Lovejoy, and that they're further ahead now than they have been at those previous stops, just because of that extra time that they were afforded. So that does at least give me a little bit of pause as far as thinking like, okay, well, maybe they might not be set back too much. Now, obviously, that's still a really, really tough district, so by no means is it a guarantee that you're going to be right back in the playoffs, because Louisville ISD and Capella are all really freaking good, and Plano East and Plano West should both be improved this season as well. But I think that there's some opportunity there for Plano to potentially make some noise in Coach Ford's first year. I'm also curious to see how Rock Hill does, the brand new school over in Prosper ISD, because it's a first year varsity program, but it's not your typical first year varsity program, because whereas most of these schools, you look at like the 2 ones that just opened up in Frisco ISD over the last few years with Memorial and Lebanon Trail. And they started out with just underclassmen. So you had these sophomores lining up against high school seniors, and you're already outmatched from a physical standpoint. Rock Hill has a full 9 through 12 class right out of the chute. They've got 28 seniors on their football team this first year. The numbers, close to 200 kids already in the program. So they're a little bit further ahead just from a physical development standpoint than a lot of these, first-year programs might be. And then just you factor in just the Mark Humble track record, their head coach. A long time, just offense, one of the most innovative offensive minds in the area. You look at his work in recent years with Lone Star and just those high-flying offenses. He's been at South Lake Carroll, Plano East, among other places. I remember covering, when he was under on Johnny Ringo's staff at Plano East. That offense looked like a Madden offense at times, with just the creativity that would sometimes go into it. Just looked like a fun offense to be a part of. So, and I don't know. I think that there might be a chance that, for them to maybe outperform what you expect normally from a first-year varsity program. Just a few first-year head coaches in our coverage area that might exceed expectations out of the chute. All right, so then let's close this out with our last question, and that is another question. It's sort of pandemic related, as far as kind of just the atmosphere of high school football games. How much will high school football's atmosphere be impacted by the pandemic related restrictions? Whether you're talking just the crowd, the band, the drill team, just all the bells and whistles that accompany one of the most unique atmospheres in high school sports. What do we kind of envision when things get going in late September for these larger schools. Devin, anything that springs to mind there as far as kind of how the atmosphere could be impacted by the restrictions in place?
I mean, it's certainly going to have an impact.
Yeah.
I mean, just it's been bizarre watching, just the bubble professional leagues and just piping in the fan noise and everything else. But that's what makes Texas high school football unique is the fact that you have these big bands and these big drill teams and just, everything that goes along with it. We've seen them, just kind of around the state, what they've done. Some have elected to not even take the band. Sunnyvale, their first week, didn't take the band. You saw some colleges this year, or this past weekend, that had their band and their cheerleaders in the end zones separated, and they didn't perform during halftime. They were performing after the game if you wanted to stay and watch them. I do like what I've seen. Some places, we've seen some other places that weren't quite practicing these social distancing measures very, very strictly. But some places had, they sent out pictures beforehand of seats that were blocked off and rows that were blocked, and so people knew exactly where to sit, and they had it all laid out. I think that's kind of what you're going to see a lot of. When we get rolling here with these bigger programs. But it's going to be tough because, I think, like we talked about before, just as with the kids and the conditioning and how they're handling it, this is going to be a week-by-week thing. There's probably going to see a lot of changes. I do think it's important that they try to incorporate it and have those other groups out there. We talk about how hard these players work year-round, how hard these coaches work year-round. People may not pay too much attention unless their kid is in it. But, these drill teams and these bands, I drive by high schools, here for the last 3 weeks, and these bands are out there at 7 o'clock in the morning, or they're out there at 5 o'clock in the evening, working, getting ready, sweating, doing all their stuff. I know the drill teams do their camps, and the cheerleaders do their things. So, they put a lot of time and effort into this too, and their main place to shine is on Friday nights because that's when they have the biggest audience. That's when they have, the most eyeballs on them. And, it'd be a shame if they were just completely denied the opportunity, plus what they add just to the atmosphere of the games.
Let's see. For me, I've actually been to a game. I actually got to cover Salina season opener against Melissa. So I was actually, I got to see kind of what the atmosphere, would look like firsthand. And as the UIL rules stipulate, it's only 50% capacity as far as the stands go. And yes, in the stands they had every other row marked off. Now, to the extent that was actually followed, so from a media standpoint, I got a feeling that we're probably not going to be sitting in the press box too often this year. At least for that game at Salina, I was in the stands, sitting at midfield and whatnot. But you just kind of see so you got the row in front of me and behind me are marked off. Well, then you get kind of early in the second quarter, and then some students start funneling into those rows. And I took at halftime, I went down, just took a picture of just the crowd, just to get a gauge of just what the crowd looked like. And you can kind of see there in the bottom of the photo, there's a cluster of a student section where it's just everybody is just nut to butt and just like a typical student section would be, but obviously not a whole lot of social distancing being practiced. As far as the masks, you had to wear one in order to get in, but as far as then how many people actually kept wearing them throughout the duration of the game, that again was not probably followed to the degree that I'm sure Salina would have liked, and that was kind of one of the prevailing takeaways from that first week is you had these videos surfacing on social media of fans and just the look in the crowd of just nobody wearing their masks. Again, all these people just clustered together to the point where, you had to have the UIL reach out and hey, guys, get it together. Otherwise, we're going to have to step in and shut the stuff down. And so there is going to have to be, because I'm just when I see that firsthand and I'm just okay, so we got kids that are behind it, behind us and in the front of us and whatnot. Well, who's going to police this stuff? There's not the employee there or whatever that's getting paid whatever just to stand there and help people find their seats or whatnot. They're not going to go there and just scream to people to separate and whatnot. It just has to be that people have to hold themselves accountable and whatnot, and just have to try to get through this together and whatnot, and just realize that it's the pandemic didn't just sneak up on us. We've been doing all this stuff now for 6 months. So whereas there are some parts of it that are certainly a beating and whatnot, but that's just the sacrifice that you have to make in order to get through this. And it doesn't only apply to the players and the coaches and whatnot. It applies to the people in the stands, just because, you have to be, you're taking a big chance going to these games during a global pandemic. So yes, you probably would like to do so knowing that that you should feel safe there. And David, it. I know that you obviously wrote a column about this last week and whatnot. So, just kind of where do you weigh in on the subject as far as kind of how you feel like the atmosphere might be influenced by the conditions that are in place?
Well, just feeding off what you're saying about the social distancing and the crowds, I think if a student section wants to go to a game, I think they need to go online and they need to look at Army student section. I don't know if you saw that from
I didn't.
Yeah, like all of them are socially distant. Like Army's, they showed it was a nationally televised game. All of like the cadets, they were spaced out. Every single one of them I saw had their masks on. And obviously, when you go to like a military school, you teach discipline over there.
Absolutely.
So, and I think they understand the rules there. So I think, you know what, guys, it's a privilege that you get to be able to go to these games. So let's not abuse it at all. Let's not ruin it for the athletes. Let's not ruin it for the coaches. Let's not ruin it for the drill team, the band members. I mean, those are the ones that people who have scholarships and college scholarships on the line right there. So let's not take that for granted right there.
As far as just how the actual atmosphere itself felt, so at the Salina Melissa game, and again, I have a feeling that every game is, like you said, Devin, every game is going to be different. Every school district is going to handle this differently, but both teams had their bands there. Both teams had their drill team, cheerleaders, and all that jazz. It didn't honestly feel that different, though, from a typical game once you got kicked off. Now, obviously, that was my first time covering a game at Salina, so with the crowd only being, half full, now I don't know how that compares to a typical Friday night, especially in a town that's as football crazed as Salina is. But as far as just the actual feel for it, and Coach Elliott afterwards when talking to him, you kind of felt like it was, it felt pretty similar to a typical football game. And kind of noticed even the same thing just in the other, like in volleyball and whatnot. And obviously, with volleyball still going on right now for those small schools as well, they've had to make their own adjustments and whatnot as far as it, playing games and whatnot and social distancing and all that. And they're not like going by and like shaking hands before and after games. Like I think in the game I saw with Salina, like they were both teams were standing at the attack lines, took a step forward and just waved to each other before playing the game. So, everybody's having to make their own sort of concessions and adjustments and whatnot and sacrifices. So, the best thing that we can do is just acknowledge the hard work that all of these programs have put into just trying to get to this point without having any of this stuff crop up. And let's not be selfish and do anything to get in the way of that.
And I think early on, in terms of a crowd capacity, it's not going to be as big of a deal as it is in these smaller towns where they have smaller stadiums.
For sure.
Because, once the playoffs roll around, that's a different animal. But, you look around, Mesquite Memorial, for instance, holds 20,000 people. So 50% capacity, they usually don't get 10,000 unless it's a big rivalry game or whatnot, Mesquite, North Mesquite, and the like. The Garland stadiums hold 10 to 12. Most of our stadiums at the 5 days and 6 days, they hold, their capacity is pretty solid in terms of you're not going to be turning a lot of people away, I don't think, early on anyway. And there's a lot of people who are going to stay away just because they're still being very cautious and playing it safe. But, we'll just have to see how it progresses, and especially once we get around to the playoffs where Texas high school football has a reputation of just blowing people's minds around the country with the number of people that show up for these games.
Outdrawing college bowl games every year and stuff,
Unfortunately, I'm going to feel sorry for some of these Allen fans for not being able to go to some of these games right here.
Yeah, it's with the distancing, too. They're having they distance them on the buses as well. So exactly how many buses is it going to take for the Allen band to get someplace? Because if you're only going to cap the number of people that can be on a bus, it could take them 3 hours to get across town.
The third week of the season is Allen's first road game, and they're at Cedar Hill, and I've got that one circled. Obviously, it's a huge game, but naturally, I am very curious to see what the Allen Road atmosphere looks like as far as how much of the band they bring along and whatnot. Should be very interesting. But it all gets going in just a little over 2 weeks with the start of the regular season for our Class 5A and 6A high schools. With that, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Star Local Media High School Sports Podcast. We are, I guess we've passed the halfway mark in our 5-part season preview, so we've got 8 more questions on the docket. We will hit those in the coming weeks. So, folks, until then, take care.